The track, I think it gets tricky because the track does lend itself to a situation where, hey, maybe I'm not having a great day. Where's the big win on me staying out here on this super controlled, monotonous, boring environment when, maybe I can just get back on one again a few months down the road and remedy what went wrong that led me to this. Versus say, like if I'm doing the Western States 100 where I don't know that I'll ever get back into that event, so I tend to look at them sort of like that. The hard part with it is on a track. One thing I have noticed is one of the biggest differences between these short looped controlled events versus these more scenic trail races is when you do have a bad patch, whether it be mentally or physically, it tends to spiral really, really quickly. So like you can easily find yourself in a situation where you hit a little bit of a rough patch, which is going to happen, and you overemphasize how bad that is, and then it starts to unravel and you call it early. I've done that before too, where I probably could have stuck it out a little longer, salvaged the day, and ran maybe not my fastest time, but a very respectable time. And then there's been times where I've just like said, all right, calm down. Just let's get comfortable for maybe a mile or two, take whatever hit that presents, and then just see what comes on the other end. Maybe things will turn on. Maybe it's just a low patch, and then 2 miles later, I'll be on the fast end of the range feeling infinitely better than I just did before. That happens as well. So I think like as I've done more of these and kind of learn kind of how those type of things present themselves, I've started to recognize spots that I should ignore and spots where I should take it a little more seriously. So like earlier on in the race, I'm a little more inclined to think like, all right, this is probably mental, a little bit of a low patch. I should probably assess whether I'm hitting my fueling strategy, my hydration strategy properly, and just get back on pace and see how that feels. Because just like the thought process, if I'm at like say mile 30 that I've already overreached, is pretty low in my mind, because it's just relative to the task at hand. It's a pretty small input, and it's just more likely to be, I'm just less likely to be off by that much based on historical data and fitness and experience and things like that. And I'm more likely to probably say, all right, let's get back into that range and see what happens. And, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I still end up blowing up near the end of the race because it probably was too aggressive. Other times I end up kind of running strong at the end of the race because it was just a low patch. So to some degree, I consider that kind of part of the game, part of the process. And the more of them you do, the more you kind of get yourself into a situation where like you've had experiences where you hit a low point where in the past you would have been like, oh, here's the spot where I start falling apart. And then you do, to, oh, I now know that I've pushed through that specific spot in the race. And that if I can do that mentally and physically, I'll come out the other end and potentially have one of my better performances. So you sort of raise the bar on yourself in terms of how many times you can kind of push through those points and find yourself on the other side. And it can become like a continual building process of like, where are your limits actually in terms of how that all plays out. But yeah, I mean, and then different events will present it a little differently too. Like when I actually broke the world record at one point, I was at that spot. I actually was peaking for a different race that year. And just the uniqueness of this particular event drew me to it. But I think it was like mile 40. I was in a situation where I had those doubts. I was like kind of falling out the slow end of the pace range. And I thought to myself, well, this wasn't my A race originally. Maybe I should just kind of like accept a slower pace for the day, run a reasonably fast time, use it as a good long training session for this next event, and then, go there and nail that. But then before I made that decision, I just kind of like reflected on just the uniqueness of that particular event. And at the time, it wasn't a guarantee that one would ever happen again. So it's like, I may never find a situation quite like this. So I'm like, well, I need to give myself a little bit more of a chance here, given those scenarios. So the fact that it wasn't something I was going to be able to replicate from an environment standpoint, again, in the future, kind of kept me more motivated to keep trying. So I just ran like kind of the splits through my head of what I needed to do from 40 to 50 and then 50 to 100K to kind of like stay where I wanted to be, and got back on kind of the positive focus standpoint. and ended up hitting those 50-mile and 100K splits a little bit faster than I projected. So then I kind of spun that around. And then just like it can get negative really quickly, it can get positive too. So knowing that, like, if you make a quick decision to change things and it ends up being the right call, you can get into a positive headspace really fast as well too, because you got all this immediate feedback that you're doing it right. You know, it's like the uniqueness of being on a track that controlled is every split is very clear as to whether you're slowing or speeding up because nothing changed. And this particular event, it was actually climate controlled too, because it was indoors, and that was the uniqueness of it. So I knew that there was nothing, not the weather, not the course, nothing was changing my pace other than me. So then, like, when I got back on and the effort started to normalize a little bit, you know, it was just such a positive kind of thing that kept spiraling in that direction for the remainder of that day for the most part. You know, you have those like situations, whereas had I been at like a just more standard outdoor track and, you know, I was looking at it like, well, I could do another one of these in 2 months, 3 months, whatever it happens to be, you know, maybe that environment isn't as like as big of a draw in terms of being able to reproduce it, and therefore, you know, give me that needed needed incentive to kind of keep going when the stuff gets a little more difficult than you had planned in certain spots.